Greetings, fellow humans. I am Hugh.
And I am Man.
And together we are definitely not
Two
kobolds in a trench coat. We enjoy human activities, such as paying taxes,
having existential crises,
and RPG horror stories. Let's see what we've got today. Today, we have a player who insists on making Constitution his dump stat, and a DM who forces a player into carrying out deplorable acts on a corpse.
Player cripples his own character and then blames the DM, by Reddit user Uzumaki420. Several months back, some friends and I started a weekly D&D night. It consisted of me, the DM, 2 other longtime friends, and the problem player, Warlock, who was the roommate of the friend who was hosting. This was Warlock's first time playing D&D. He was nice enough, but was also somewhat stubborn and did not want to take anyone's advice when creating his character. For example, he said he wanted to be an all-purpose caster, whatever that means, and decided to pick a warlock. DM told him, rightly, that if he wanted a more diverse form of caster, he should consider a sorcerer or a wizard, because warlocks typically end up spamming Eldritch Blast for most of the game. He ignored DM's advice and took the warlock anyway. That's not too big a deal, but here's where the warlock committed seppuku. He'd given himself an 8 in Constitution. Naturally, when the DM saw that he was using Constitution as his dump stat, he very strongly recommended that he change that. Warlock, however, was not having it. His argument was that he was going to be on the back lines all the time, so he didn't need a lot of HP. We all kept telling him that an 8 in Constitution was a delayed death sentence to his character, but he refused to hear it. We eventually just said screw it and decided to let him learn the hard way. The first few levels, he was just barely surviving, almost dying 4 times, so it was obvious his character was on borrowed time.
I'm struggling to figure out what on earth he thought was more important than Constitution, or at least how he thought every other stat was more important. How he could potentially be in a world where at a level up, he would gain 0 HP.
Especially for a magic caster, they're squishy on the best of days. Eldritch Blast can only get you so far. Can't give you more HP though.
Well man, you know the old saying, you can lead the problem player to dice, but you can't fix his stupid. That's a very human saying, right?
I believe that's what the humans say. So fast forward a few months and we are level 4 on Dragon of Icespire Peak. Warlock at this point had a maximum of 15 hit points. Small enough for something like a dragon to one-shot him. During the Dragons of Icespire Peak, whenever a party long rests or travels, the DM rolls a d20 to determine what the location of the dragon is at. Our bad luck though, it spots us on our way to Butterskull Ranch and the combat starts. Further bad luck on the initiative and Cryovane went first. Bad for us because he was able to hit 3 of us with his ice breath, 10d8. All in all, it came out to 52 damage if you failed the save, which Warlock did. So he was dead. Not unconscious, dead. As in, he took enough damage to bypass his death saves.
Did somebody say consequences?
Oh, hello, consequences for my actions that everybody saw coming.
All aboard the consequences train!
So it's at this point that Warlock is turning visibly red. For a second, I was extremely uncomfortable because I thought that he was going to start crying. Instead, he just sat there staring daggers at the DM like he just threatened his mother. The DM could not have failed to notice and seemed to sense a tantrum coming. He tried to cut out ahead of it and started saying how it was no big deal and he can just make a new character since we were all very low level. He was very kind about it and never once did he say, "I told you so." That is, until Warlock blew up and started accusing the DM of targeting him. To his further credit, our DM just silently sat there calm as can be while the Warlock said that he was a terrible DM and how the DMs that he watches on YouTube are so much better and blah blah blah. After Warlock finally wore himself out, DM looked at him in the eye, very calmly reminded him that the entire table, including the other new player, had warned him from the very beginning that an 8 in Constitution was a death sentence. I wish I could tell you that he flipped the table before storming out, but what he did and said was so much more cringe. He did storm out of the room, but he went upstairs to his room instead. Moments later, we start hear him blasting death metal out of his speakers at full volume as if he was the king of edgelords. We tried to ignore it for about 30 minutes, but it was making the game very difficult to play. Eventually, his roommate went upstairs to reason with him. The only response he got was a thud when the warlock threw something at the door. We just decided to call it for the night. We decided to just call it a night and hold the game night at someone else's apartment next time. Needless to say, Warlock is not going to return. In DM's word, even if he does apologize, there's no place for that kind of toxicity at our table. Incredible to me how a 25-year-old man is capable of behaving like a child who did not get his way even after we warned him about the outcome from day one.
I mean, yeah, the guy was given plenty of warning and advised how bad an idea it was to take Constitution as a dump stat. Something which should never be lower in your priorities than your third stats. He made himself a liability to the party. He put himself in a position where, yeah, he was vulnerable to this, and the inevitable happened, and then blamed other people for his own mistakes.
I mean, I get having a dump stat that you don't really think about, and if you're a warlock, you're thinking, oh yeah, I'm at the back. But when literally everybody at the table says, bro, that is definitely the worst idea that you could come up with, maybe listen next time, because maybe other people who are more experienced actually know what they're talking about. Okay, so you've watched some games on YouTube. Good for you. That doesn't mean that you know what you're talking about when it comes to D&D. Maybe he should get a microphone and a podcast.
Yeah, this is just classic man-child behavior. Thought he knew best, didn't listen to anyone, and then blames everyone else for the inevitable consequences of his poor decisions.
That was the best part to me, honestly, was the fact that he stormed off and then blasted up death metal music. Careful there, buddy. You might cut yourself on all that edge you're serving.
GM attempts to force my character into partaking in necrophilia by Reddit user Grimsbane. Hey everyone, I wanted to share my first experience with tabletop RPGs, which was Vampire the Masquerade 3rd edition. This was actually my first time ever playing a tabletop RPG, and it was an online game through Discord. I really enjoyed the system and found it quite intriguing. I got introduced to the group through a mutual friend I hadn't spoken to in a while, who was a player in the game. I created a Malkavian, a vampire clan known for being insane. My character had a thirst for power as part of their archetype. In the first session, it was just me and the GM, who introduced me to the setting, and I liked it. However, in the second session, a new player joined. Not my friend, but he was listening in. We were on a boat talking to a high-ranking vampire named Jack Sparrow. He was going to give us a job, but while we were chatting, a woman arrived who was described as being in a sort of hypnotic state. The GM explained that it was common on the boat to have humans feed the vampires, which was more flavorful than just drinking from blood bags. He told me to try her out, so my character bit her neck and started feeding. Then he described how the beast, a voice in every vampire's head that pushes them towards acts that go against their humanity, was influencing me. The beast compelled me to drain the woman's blood and then inject my own blood into her, which would turn her into a vampire under my control. Creating new vampires without the Lord's permission is a crime punishable by death, so I had to spend humanity points to resist this violent impulse. This seemed to fit my character's thirst for power, though I don't recall if this is how humanity points actually worked in the system. Even with spending the points, my character ended up draining all her blood until she died. What came next was troubling. The GM described my character, consumed by the beast, taking her to a room where I could eat her. In my language, this could imply both cannibalism and sexual acts. Jack Sparrow, the NPC controlled by the GM, grabbed my wrist to persuade me to stop, but my character still took her to the room. It felt incredibly frustrating and confusing, especially since the GM had been pushing me towards this in the first place.
So I've never played Vampire the Masquerade, and I'm not familiar with how the whole humanity versus the beast, but that is something that if it is standard within Vampire the Masquerade, GMs do need to be very careful with, because you don't want to override player autonomy. And in this case, it does seem to be overriding his player autonomy in a very disturbing way given what they're doing.
It seems to me this was taken too far. I can understand the feeding thing, but beyond that, that feels like a bit of a boundary violation, especially if you're pushing them towards sexual acts.
Yeah, for sure. If it's just a feeding versus not feeding, that's fine. But yeah, when we're talking about actually like essay type elements. Players should not ever be pushed to do something like that. Well, to be honest, nobody should be doing any of that, but you should not be pushing your players in that direction.
I felt extremely uncomfortable but didn't speak up immediately. In the room, the beast told me again to eat her, which I interpreted as a sexual act. Feeling very uneasy, I first described my character biting her finger as a compromise. However, the beast continued to push, making it clear that the act was meant to be sexual. Despite being deeply uncomfortable, I eventually stated that I wouldn't commit necrophilia, obviously. I had to spend more humanity and even blood points to try to resist the impulse and ultimately left her body in the room. I was deeply unsettled, but was too shy at the time to complain. The rest of the session involved me and another player fighting Jack Sparrow to prove our worth. After that session, I spoke with my friends who agreed that the content was too heavy and unnecessary. The campaign ended there, and I left the RPG group and didn't speak to them again. This happened in 2020 at the start of the pandemic. By 2022, I gave tabletop RPGs another chance, but had no desire to return to Vampire the Masquerade. I played D&D campaigns like Tomb of Annihilation and Mines of Phandelver with a new group of friends, and they were all great. Since then, I've been passionate about RPGs and have played in several groups and campaigns. However, before joining any new group, I make a point to clearly state what topics I'm uncomfortable with, especially any form of essay. It was a terrible experience for my first RPG, but I've moved past the trauma, thankfully.
Yeah, that's so much ick. And the fact that you had to expend so much humanity points or whatever just to not do something that...
Well, you shouldn't be using them to resist committing essay. Other stuff, fine. Murder. Murder's okay. Humans are okay with murder, I hear.
Humans are rather fond of it, I hear. Either way, something like SA, yeah, 100%. That's not something that you essentially roll to resist. That should be something that you're already resisting.
In D&D, playing a good warlock who has an evil patron forcing them into doing evil things can be a lot of fun, and that emotional conflict. That creates a great character arc. Just it has to be aligned with it, and this was clearly well over it.
Anything that is a little morally gray or anything like that, it should be pre-discussed between DM and player. Even if it's something like, oh, if you're a warlock and your patron might ask you to do something disturbing, that should be discussed. The parameters of that should be discussed between the DM and the player before the game. This should not be something that the DM springs on the player. The limits of it should always be agreed on before the game starts.
Hey man.
Hey, what?
In Rivendell, where do you go when you need medical treatment?
Where?
The National Elf Service. And with that, we have definitely not been two kobolds in a trench coat. Be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and make the necessary sacrifices to Tiamat. We'll see you next time.